For 16 years of Balkan chaos, a handyman buried neighbours and refugees alike, right under police noses. The morning fog hung thick over the Sava River on November 15, 2007, when Zagreb police received the call that would finally unmask one of Europe's most prolific and overlooked serial killers. In a small apartment on Ilika Street, investigators discovered not just another crime scene, but the final chapter of a 16-year reign of terror that had claimed more than 30 lives across war-torn and post-war Croatia. Krunoslav Prates, a seemingly ordinary 42-year-old labourer with calloused hands and an unremarkable face, had just confessed to his landlord about the things he had done during the war and after. What emerged from that confession would reveal how one man had exploited the chaos of the Yugoslav wars and the subsequent social upheaval to become one of the most successful serial killers in modern European history, operating virtually undetected in a nation too broken to notice its missing people. The story of Krunoslav Prates begins not with violence, but with the crushing ordinariness that would later provide his perfect camouflage. Born on March 3, 1965, in a working-class neighbourhood of Zagreb, Prates grew up in a Yugoslavia that was beginning to show the first hairline cracks that would eventually shatter it entirely. His father, Marko, worked in the Končar electrical factory, while his mother, Dragica, cleaned offices in the city centre during the pre-dawn hours, when the streets belonged to shift workers and shadows. The Prates family lived in a cramped two-room apartment in Trešnjevka, a district that housed thousands of families just like theirs, neither poor enough to draw pity, nor prosperous enough to inspire envy. Young Krunoslav was an unremarkable child who blended seamlessly into the grey uniformity of socialist Yugoslavia. His elementary school teachers would later struggle to remember him at all, describing a boy who sat in the middle rows, turned in adequate work, and never caused trouble or drew attention. But beneath this facade of normalcy, something darker was already taking root. Neighbours would occasionally notice the family's cat limping, or find small animals dead in the courtyard with wounds that seemed too precise to be accidental. Dragica Prates dismissed these incidents as the work of stray dogs, never suspecting that her 12-year-old son was conducting his first experiments in death. By 1987, Prates had completed his mandatory military service in the Yugoslav People's Army, where he served as a logistics clerk in a supply depot near Sarajevo. His commanding officers noted his reliability and punctuality, but also his peculiar preference for night shifts and solitary duties. He volunteered frequently for guard duty, spending long hours alone with only the darkness and his thoughts for company. It was during these silent watches that Prates later claimed he first understood what he truly was. When the Yugoslav wars erupted in 1991, 26-year-old Krunoslav Prates found himself in a position that would prove catastrophically perfect for his emerging pathology. As a former JNA serviceman, he was initially mobilized into the Croatian army, but his real value came from his intimate knowledge of military logistics and supply routes. More importantly, the complete breakdown of civil authority, the massive displacement of populations, and the general atmosphere of violence and death provided him with both opportunity and cover that would have been impossible in peacetime. The first confirmed victim of Krunoslav Prates was 19-year-old Milica Savic, a Serbian refugee who had fled Vukovar with her family in November 1991. The Savics, like thousands of other displaced persons, had ended up in a hastily organized refugee center in a former school building on the outskirts of Zagreb. Conditions were primitive. Hundreds of people crammed into classrooms, sharing inadequate bathroom facilities, depending on irregular food deliveries, and existing in a legal grey zone where their movements and activities were barely monitored. Prates, who had volunteered to help distribute supplies to refugee centres, met Milica during one of his regular deliveries. She was a small, dark-haired girl who spoke in the distinctive accent of Eastern Slavonia and carried herself with the particular wariness of someone who had seen too much too young. According to witness statements collected years later, Prates showed unusual interest in Milica, often seeking her out specifically when making deliveries and offering her small extras: cigarettes, chocolate, personal hygiene items that were precious commodities in the crowded centre. On December 8, 1991, Milica told her roommates she was going to meet someone who might help her family secure better accommodations. She left the centre around 7 p.m., wearing a thin blue jacket and carrying a small handbag containing her identity documents, papers that would never be found. Her body was discovered 3 days later in a wooded area near Maximir Park by a man walking his dog. She had been strangled with what the coroner determined was likely a leather belt, and there were signs of sexual assault. In the chaos of wartime Zagreb, with thousands of refugees, regular air raid sirens, and a police force overwhelmed by the demands of a nation at war, Milica Savic's murder received minimal investigation. She was buried in an unmarked grave in Zagreb's Mirogoj cemetery, one of dozens of unidentified victims of what authorities assumed was the general violence of wartime. Her family, having fled further west to Slovenia, never learned of her death. This first killing established a pattern that Prates would refine over the next 16 years. He targeted society's most vulnerable members: refugees, homeless individuals, prostitutes, elderly people living alone, and others whose disappearances were unlikely to trigger intensive investigations. He was particularly drawn to women and men who existed on the margins, people whose absence would be noticed too late or not at all. During the war years of 1991 to 1995, Prates killed at least 15 people, though investigators believe the actual number may be significantly higher. His victims included Marko Petrovic, a 68-year-old retired carpenter, found beaten to death in his basement workshop in January 1992. Jasna Nikolic, a 23-year-old woman working as a prostitute near the main railway station, discovered strangled in February 1992. And Tomislav Juric, a 45-year-old alcoholic who lived rough in various abandoned buildings, whose body was found in March 1992 with severe head trauma. What made Prates particularly dangerous during this period was his ability to move freely throughout the region while maintaining legitimate cover. His work distributing humanitarian supplies gave him access to refugee populations, knowledge of who was vulnerable, and a plausible explanation for being in various locations at unusual hours. He had also begun developing the psychological manipulation skills that would serve him throughout his killing career. Anna Markovic, who survived an encounter with Prates in 1993, later described his approach to investigators. He seemed so helpful, so concerned. He said he knew about places where refugees could find work or better housing. He had this way of making you feel like he really understood your situation, like he had been through similar struggles. It was only when we were alone that I saw something change in his eyes, something cold and calculating that made me realize I was in terrible danger. Markovic escaped only because a group of other refugees came looking for her when she failed to return to the center as promised. They found her bound with telephone wire in the basement of an abandoned building, where Prates had been preparing to kill her. He fled when he heard their voices, and Markovic was too traumatized and disoriented to provide a detailed description to police. The end of the Croatian War of Independence in 1995 brought new challenges for Prates, but also new opportunities. As Croatia began the painful process of rebuilding, massive population movements continued as people returned to reclaim destroyed homes or migrated to cities seeking employment. The country's infrastructure was shattered, police resources remained stretched thin, and social services were overwhelmed. In this environment of continued instability, people still disappeared regularly without triggering the kind of comprehensive investigations that might have exposed Prates' activities. Moreover, the transition to peacetime revealed new vulnerabilities that Prates was quick to exploit. The rapid privatization of formerly state-owned enterprises created widespread unemployment, while the emergence of organized crime networks and the proliferation of small arms made violence more common and less likely to draw special attention. Homeless populations swelled in major cities, and the breakdown of extended family networks left many elderly people isolated and vulnerable. Between 1995 and 2000, Prates adapted his methods to this changing environment. He found employment at various construction sites around Zagreb and surrounding areas, work that again provided him with legitimate reasons to be in different locations, and gave him access to tools and private spaces where he could commit his crimes. His victims during this period included construction workers, elderly homeowners living alone, and women working in the informal economy. One of his most calculated killings during this period was that of Stjepan Božić, a 73-year-old widower who lived alone in a small house in Sesvete, a suburb of Zagreb. Božić had hired Prates to do repair work on his roof in September 1997. Over several weeks, Prates gained the old man's trust, learning about his habits, his lack of nearby family, and his practice of keeping significant amounts of cash hidden in his home rather than trusting banks. On October 15, 1997, neighbors found Božić's body in his kitchen. He had been beaten to death with a hammer, one of his own tools, and his house had been ransacked. Police initially investigated it as a burglary gone wrong, a conclusion that seemed supported by the missing cash and the obvious signs of forced entry. However, the crime scene contained subtle indicators that suggested the killer had intimate knowledge of the house layout and the victim's habits. The forced entry had been staged after the murder, and the ransacking was too thorough and systematic to be the panicked searching of a surprised burglar. Prates had been careful to establish an alibi by showing up at a bar near his own apartment shortly after the estimated time of death, making sure to interact with several regular customers who would remember seeing him. This attention to alibi construction became a consistent feature of his later crimes, demonstrating a level of premeditation and criminal sophistication that belied his working-class exterior. The psychological profile that would later emerge from extensive interviews with Prates revealed a killer who was simultaneously organized and opportunistic, capable of elaborate planning, but also willing to improvise when unexpected opportunities presented themselves. Dr. Maria Kovacevic, the forensic psychiatrist who conducted the most comprehensive evaluation of Prates after his arrest, described him as a predator with an almost supernatural ability to identify vulnerability and exploit the social chaos around him. As Croatia stabilized and entered the new millennium, Prates faced the challenge of continuing his killing while adapting to improved law enforcement capabilities and social services. However, he discovered that certain populations remained effectively invisible to authorities. Migrant workers from Bosnia and Serbia, elderly people estranged from their families, and individuals struggling with addiction or mental illness continued to exist on the margins of society, where their disappearances might go unnoticed for weeks or months. Between 2000 and 2005, Prates killed at least 10 more people, refining his techniques and becoming increasingly bold. He had developed a particular method for approaching potential victims, often posing as someone who could help solve their problems, offering work, housing, or other assistance that would lure them to isolated locations. His victims during this period included Božena Novak, a 55-year-old Czech woman working illegally as a house cleaner, found murdered in an abandoned warehouse in 2002. Dragan Simic, a 42-year-old man with schizophrenia who lived on the streets, discovered beaten to death under a bridge in 2003. And Maria Kvetkovic, a 68-year-old woman living alone after her children emigrated to Germany, found strangled in her apartment in 2004. The Kvetkovic murder nearly exposed Prates 3 years before his eventual capture. A neighbor had seen him leaving the building around the estimated time of death and provided police with a detailed description. However, the investigation stalled when Prates provided what appeared to be a solid alibi. He had been at work at a construction site across town, with multiple witnesses who claimed to remember seeing him there. What investigators didn't realize was that Prates had carefully cultivated relationships with co-workers who were willing to lie for him, often in exchange for small favors or simply because they liked and trusted him. This ability to inspire loyalty and deflect suspicion was perhaps Prates' most remarkable characteristic. Neighbors consistently described him as helpful and reliable, someone who would shovel snow from elderly residents' walkways, help carry groceries, or lend tools without being asked to return them. He attended the local Catholic church irregularly, but visibly, contributing small amounts to collections and volunteering occasionally for community events. His landlords universally praised him as an ideal tenant who paid rent on time, kept his living space clean, and never caused problems. This carefully constructed facade of normalcy and helpfulness served multiple purposes. It provided him with alibis and character witnesses when needed, but more importantly, it gave him access to potential victims and information about vulnerable people in his community. His helpfulness was never random. He consistently sought out opportunities to assist people who lived alone, had few social connections, or existed on the economic margins. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Prates to maintain this double life for so many years fascinated the experts who later studied his case. Unlike many serial killers who struggle to control their impulses or whose behavior becomes increasingly erratic, Prates demonstrated remarkable self-discipline and long-term planning. He could go months between killings when circumstances required caution, and he never allowed his crimes to interfere with his public persona. Dr. Kovacevic's analysis suggested that Prates had developed what she termed compartmentalized empathy, the ability to genuinely connect with and care about certain people, while simultaneously viewing others as objects to be manipulated and destroyed. He wasn't a complete sociopath, she explained in her report. He was capable of forming attachments and experiencing genuine emotions. But he had created psychological categories that allowed him to view certain types of people as fundamentally different from himself and therefore acceptable targets. This psychological complexity became evident in the years immediately preceding his capture. Between 2005 and 2007, Prates' behavior began to show subtle changes that suggested increasing internal pressure. His killings became slightly more frequent, and there were signs that he was taking greater risks. The victims during this final period included Nikola Marjanovic, a homeless veteran, found beaten to death behind a shopping centre in early 2006, and Vesna Babic, a 43-year-old woman with developmental disabilities who disappeared while walking to a social services appointment in late 2006. The Babic case attracted more media attention than Prates' previous crimes because she was a sympathetic victim whose disappearance was noticed quickly by her care workers. Police conducted a more thorough investigation, and for the first time, witnesses reported seeing her talking to a middle-aged man near where she was last seen. However, the description was too general to be useful, and the investigation eventually went cold. What investigators didn't know was that Prates was beginning to experience what he later described as an increasing need to kill. The careful spacing that had characterized his earlier crimes was breaking down, and he was finding it harder to resist opportunities, even when circumstances weren't ideal. This psychological deterioration would prove to be his undoing. The beginning of the end came in October 2007, when Prates murdered Đuro Savic, a 61-year-old janitor who worked at a school in Prates' neighborhood. Savic was a widower who lived alone but maintained regular contact with his adult children and had a predictable daily routine that made his disappearance immediately noticeable. When he failed to show up for work on October 23rd, his supervisor called police within hours. The investigation of Savic's disappearance was more thorough than previous cases, partly because he was a more integrated member of the community, and partly because Croatian police procedures had improved significantly since the early post-war years. Investigators quickly established that Savic had been seen talking to someone near his apartment building on the evening of October 22nd, and they began systematically interviewing everyone in the area. Prates, as a long-time resident of the neighborhood, was among those questioned. He claimed to have known Savic only casually and provided what seemed like a routine alibi. He said he had been at home watching television alone. However, something about his manner during the interview troubled Detective Inspector Miroslav Tomic, who was leading the investigation. There was something too rehearsed about his responses, Tomic later recalled. Most people, when you ask them about a missing neighbor, show some emotion, concern, curiosity, something. But Prates was completely flat, almost clinical. And his alibi was too detailed for something supposedly routine. When people are really just sitting at home watching TV, they usually can't remember exactly what programs they watched or what time they went to bed. But he had everything memorized. Tomic began conducting discreet inquiries about Prates, checking his background and looking for any connections to previous unsolved cases. What he found was troubling. Prates' name appeared in the periphery of several investigations over the years, usually as someone who had known a victim casually or had been in the general area around the time of a crime. Individually, these connections seemed like coincidence, but the pattern was suggestive enough to warrant closer attention. Meanwhile, Prates was struggling with increasing psychological pressure. The more intensive investigation of Savic's disappearance had shaken his confidence, and he was beginning to suspect that police attention was focusing on him. He had always been able to compartmentalize his crimes, but the mounting stress was making it harder to maintain his carefully constructed, normal life. On November 10, 2007, Prates killed again. His victim was Maria Knežević, a 72-year-old woman who lived alone in a ground-floor apartment near the city centre. Unlike his previous crimes, this killing seemed rushed and sloppy. Knežević's body was found the next day by her daughter, who had come for a scheduled visit. The crime scene showed signs of a struggle, and neighbours reported hearing unusual noises during the night. More critically, a traffic camera had captured footage of a man matching Prates' description leaving the area around the estimated time of death. The image quality wasn't sufficient for positive identification, but it provided enough detail to narrow the pool of suspects significantly. Detective Inspector Tomic now had what he believed was a serial killer operating in Zagreb, and Prates had moved to the top of his suspect list. However, Croatian law required substantial evidence before arrests could be made, and Tomic needed either physical evidence linking Prates to the crimes or a confession. He decided to increase surveillance while gathering more evidence. This decision proved prescient. On November 14, 2007, Prates attempted to kill again. His intended victim was Milan Horvat, a homeless man who frequented the area around Zagreb's main railway station. Prates approached Horvat with his usual offer of help, in this case, promising warm food and a place to sleep in exchange for some light labour. However, Horvat had been warned by other homeless individuals to be suspicious of such offers, following rumours about people disappearing from their community. When Prates led him to an isolated area near the railway yards, Horvat became suspicious and tried to leave. Prates attacked him with a knife, but Horvat managed to fight back and escape, suffering serious but non-fatal wounds. He immediately sought help from railway police, providing a detailed description of his attacker and the specific location of the assault. Police responding to Horvat's report found the knife Prates had dropped during the struggle, along with other evidence, including footprints and fibres that would later be matched to clothing in Prates' apartment. More importantly, Horvat's description matched the suspect profile that Tomic had been developing, and the location was consistent with the theory that their killer had intimate knowledge of Zagreb's infrastructure and hidden spaces. Armed with this evidence, police obtained a warrant to search Prates' apartment. What they found there exceeded their worst expectations. Hidden behind a false wall in his bedroom closet, investigators discovered what Detective Inspector Tomic described as a shrine to murder. Dozens of personal items taken from victims, including jewelry, identification documents, photographs, and other mementos. There were items dating back to 1991, providing a timeline of kills that spanned 16 years. Most shocking was a detailed journal Prates had kept, documenting not just his crimes but his psychological state and planning process. Written in a mixture of Croatian and Serbian, the journal revealed the mind of a killer who had spent years perfecting his craft while maintaining a facade of normalcy that had fooled everyone around him. When police arrived at his apartment on the morning of November 15, 2007, Prates was ready for them. He had spent the previous night destroying what evidence he could and had already decided not to resist arrest. According to his landlord, Ivo Maric, Prates had knocked on his door around 6 a.m. and said simply, "I need to tell someone about the things I have done. The police will be here soon." Prates' arrest sent shockwaves through Croatia and the broader region. Here was a killer who had operated successfully for 16 years, claiming at least 30 lives in a country that prided itself on having overcome the chaos of the 1990s and established effective rule of law. The revelation that such a predator had been living and working among normal citizens, helping elderly neighbours with their groceries while simultaneously hunting vulnerable victims, challenged fundamental assumptions about community safety and police effectiveness. During his interrogation, Prates proved to be unexpectedly cooperative. Unlike many serial killers who minimize their crimes or attempt to shift blame, he provided detailed confessions to murders that police hadn't even connected to him. His memory for dates, locations, and specific details was remarkable, suggesting that he had mentally catalogued each killing with the precision of an accountant recording transactions. Dr. Kovacevic, who interviewed Prates extensively during his psychological evaluation, described his demeanor as almost relieved once he began confessing. "He told me that keeping the secret had become increasingly exhausting," she noted. "He said it was like carrying a weight that grew heavier each year. By the end, he was actually grateful that someone finally knew who he really was." The trial of Krunoslav Prates began in Zagreb County Court on March 15, 2008, and lasted for nearly 8 months. The prosecution, led by Deputy State Attorney Dragan Silovic, faced the challenge of proving multiple murders in cases where physical evidence was often limited due to the passage of time and initial investigative shortcomings. However, Prates' confessions, corroborated by the evidence found in his apartment and the testimony of surviving witnesses like Anna Markovic and Milan Horvat, built an overwhelming case. The defense, appointed by the court since Prates could not afford private counsel, argued for diminished capacity based on psychological evaluation results that suggested personality disorders and possible trauma from his wartime experiences. However, Dr. Kovacevic's assessment concluded that while Prates showed signs of antisocial personality disorder, he was fully aware of the nature and consequences of his actions and was legally responsible for his crimes. Perhaps most damaging to any insanity defense was the evidence of Prates' careful planning and his ability to maintain normal relationships and employment for years while committing murders. The prosecution argued that his behavior demonstrated clear premeditation and criminal sophistication, inconsistent with diminished capacity. The trial also revealed the broader systemic failures that had allowed Prates to operate undetected for so long. Police officials acknowledged that the chaos of the war years and the subsequent focus on organized crime and corruption had left serial crimes by individual perpetrators as a lower priority. The lack of coordination between different police jurisdictions, inadequate resources for investigating deaths among marginalized populations, and the general social upheaval of the post-war period had created an environment where a careful predator could thrive. On November 7, 2008, after deliberating for less than 6 hours, the jury found Krunoslav Prates guilty on 31 counts of first-degree murder and multiple counts of assault, robbery, and other related charges. Judge Marko Simic sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, the maximum sentence available under Croatian law. In his final statement to the court, Prates offered what seemed like a genuine apology to the families of his victims, many of whom had attended the trial proceedings. "I know that nothing I can say will bring back the people I killed or ease the pain I have caused," he said in a barely audible voice. "I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it. I only hope that my capture means no other families will suffer because of me." The case of Krunoslav Prates fundamentally changed Croatian law enforcement's approach to investigating violent crime. The Croatian Ministry of Interior implemented new protocols for tracking unsolved murders, improving coordination between jurisdictions, and maintaining databases of missing persons. Special attention was directed toward crimes involving vulnerable populations, homeless individuals, elderly people living alone, migrants, and others who had been largely invisible to previous investigative efforts. Dr. Maria Kovacevic's research on the Prates case contributed to the development of new psychological profiling techniques specifically adapted to post-conflict societies, where traditional patterns of serial killing might be obscured by broader social violence and instability. Her work has been studied by law enforcement agencies throughout the Balkans and other regions recovering from armed conflict. The broader implications of the Prates case extend beyond criminology into questions about social responsibility and community awareness. How does a serial killer operate for 16 years in communities where neighbors pride themselves on looking out for each other? What does it mean that the same person who would shovel an elderly neighbor's walkway could also be planning to murder other vulnerable individuals? These questions became particularly acute when investigators discovered that several of Prates' victims had been killed within blocks of where he lived, sometimes in buildings where he was known and trusted by other residents. The cognitive dissonance between his public persona and his private actions forced a broader reckoning with assumptions about how well people truly know their neighbors and communities. Prates himself, in interviews conducted by Dr. Kovacevic, provided some insight into this psychological compartmentalization. "I never thought of myself as a bad person," he told her. "I helped people when I could. I was a good worker, a good neighbor. But there were these other people, the ones who were already lost, already broken. It seemed like I was just finishing what had already been started." This rationalization, while clearly self-serving, reveals something troubling about how society's marginalized populations can become invisible, not just to institutions, but to predators who exploit that invisibility. Prates didn't choose his victims randomly. He specifically targeted people whose disappearances were unlikely to trigger intensive investigations or sustained public attention. The families of Prates' victims have struggled with questions that extend beyond individual grief to broader social justice issues. Why did it take 16 years to catch a killer who was operating openly in communities where he was known? Why were the disappearances of refugees, homeless individuals, and isolated elderly people not investigated with the same resources and attention given to victims from more privileged backgrounds? Milica Savic's sister, Jelena, who only learned of her sibling's death when Prates was arrested, expressed these concerns during the trial. "My sister was a human being with hopes and dreams, just like anyone else. But because she was a refugee, because she didn't have powerful friends or important connections, her murder was ignored for 16 years. How many other families are still waiting for answers because their loved ones didn't matter enough to the people in charge?" These questions remain painfully relevant not just in Croatia, but throughout the world, where vulnerable populations continue to face disproportionate risks of violence, while receiving inadequate protection from institutions designed to serve all citizens equally. Krunoslav Prates remains imprisoned in Zagreb's central prison, where he has become something of a model prisoner. Guards describe him as quiet, cooperative, and focused on educational programs and prison jobs. He has expressed interest in writing a more detailed account of his crimes, ostensibly to help law enforcement and researchers better understand serial killing, though victims' families have generally opposed such projects. Dr. Kovacevic continues to interview Prates periodically as part of ongoing research into the psychology of serial killers. She notes that he appears to have genuinely accepted responsibility for his crimes and shows what seem like authentic signs of remorse, though she cautions that his psychological profile makes it difficult to assess the sincerity of such expressions. He remains a fascinating and troubling case study, she explains. Unlike many serial killers who are clearly sociopathic or show obvious signs of mental illness, Prates retained the capacity for normal human relationships and emotions throughout his killing career. Understanding how someone can maintain that duality, genuine care for some people alongside the ability to murder others, is crucial for developing better tools to identify and stop such predators before they can claim so many victims. The legacy of the Prates case extends beyond its immediate impact on Croatian law enforcement and criminal justice. It serves as a stark reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who blend most successfully into normal society, who earn trust and respect while secretly exploiting the vulnerabilities of those around them. In a broader sense, the case illustrates how social upheaval, whether from war, economic transition, or other disruptions, can create environments where predators thrive by exploiting institutional weaknesses and taking advantage of populations that fall through the cracks of official attention and protection. The fog that hung over Zagreb on that November morning in 2007 has long since lifted, but the questions raised by Krunoslav Prates' 16-year killing spree continue to resonate. How many other predators operate in plain sight, protected by community trust and institutional blindness? How many vulnerable people remain at risk because their lives are deemed less worthy of attention and protection? These are not just Croatian questions or Balkan questions. They are universal challenges that confront every society that claims to value human life equally while consistently failing to protect its most vulnerable members. The story of Krunoslav Prates is ultimately not just about one man's descent into evil, but about the social conditions and institutional failures that allow that evil to flourish unchecked for far too long. In the end, justice for Prates' victims came not from the legal system that failed them in life, but from the persistence of a single detective who refused to accept that their deaths were just unfortunate statistics in a chaotic time. Detective Inspector Miroslav Tomic, who retired shortly after Prates' conviction, perhaps summarized the case most effectively. We cannot bring back the people he killed, but we can honor their memory by ensuring that no one else suffers the same fate. That means seeing the invisible, protecting the vulnerable, and never accepting that some lives matter less than others. The Wolf of Zagreb has been caged, but the hunt for others like him continues in communities around the world where predators still walk among us, hiding behind helpful smiles and neighborly concern while searching for their next victims among society's forgotten and forsaken. The Apat Falva ghoul. The autumn mist clung to the cobblestones of Apat Falva like a burial shroud in the pre-dawn hours of October 15th, 1916. In the small Hungarian village nestled along the banks of the Danube, where sheep bells still echoed across rolling hills and horse-drawn carts navigated narrow medieval streets, modernity felt like a distant rumour. The Great War raged across Europe, claiming sons and fathers, but in this pocket of rural tranquility, death had been stalking with a different kind of methodical precision, one that would soon reveal itself as the work of a monster who had been hiding in plain sight for over a decade. Village Constable Ferenc Molnar's heavy boots echoed against the morning silence as he approached the small stone cottage on Templum Street, responding to what he assumed would be another routine domestic disturbance. The caller, an elderly neighbour named Mrs. Erzsébet Takacs, had reported screaming from the Horváth residence the night before, followed by an unsettling quiet that stretched until dawn. As Molnar pushed open the wooden gate, its hinges protesting with a rusty groan, he couldn't have imagined that he was about to uncover evidence of what would become known as one of Hungary's most disturbing serial murder cases. A decade-long killing spree that had claimed 25 lives, while the perpetrator moved through their community like a spectre of death. The front door stood ajar, swaying gently in the October breeze. Inside, the scene that greeted Constable Molnar would haunt him for the remainder of his days. János Horváth, a 43-year-old blacksmith known throughout Apatfalva for his gentle demeanour and skilled craftsmanship, lay sprawled across his kitchen floor in a pool of congealed blood. His throat had been slashed with surgical precision, the wound so deep it had nearly severed his head from his body. But it was the positioning of the corpse that sent ice through Molnar's veins. Horváth had been arranged in a grotesque tableau, his arms crossed over his chest in a mockery of peaceful repose, coins placed over his eyes in an ancient burial ritual that seemed to transform the humble kitchen into a macabre funeral parlour. The discovery of János Horváth's body would prove to be the final thread that, when pulled, would unravel a tapestry of horror stretching back to 1906. For 10 years, the residents of Apatfalva and surrounding villages had whispered about unexplained disappearances and mysterious deaths that seemed to cluster around times of celebration and community gathering. Harvest festivals, wedding ceremonies, religious holidays, occasions that should have brought joy instead became associated with an inexplicable pattern of violence that local authorities had dismissed as coincidental tragedies, bandit attacks, or the unfortunate casualties of a region struggling with poverty and social upheaval. The man responsible for this decade of terror was Peter Kovács, 34 years old in 1916, a travelling merchant who had built his entire adult life around the careful cultivation of trust and respectability. Born in 1882 in the neighbouring village of Baxbokod to a family of modest means, Kovács had demonstrated from an early age an unsettling combination of charm and calculating intelligence that would serve him well in his future endeavours. His father, István Kovács, worked as a seasonal labourer, moving from farm to farm during harvest time, while his mother, Anna, took in sewing to supplement the family's meagre income. By all accounts, young Peter was a quiet, studious child who showed no obvious signs of the monster he would become. The first hint of Kovács's disturbed psychology emerged during his adolescent years, though it would only be recognised in retrospect after his eventual capture. His younger sister, Maria, would later testify that Peter displayed an obsessive fascination with death and dying from approximately age 12. She recalled finding him in their family's small barn, conducting elaborate funeral ceremonies for dead animals he had collected. Mice, birds, sometimes larger creatures like cats or dogs that had died of natural causes or been killed by other animals. But what disturbed Maria most was not the mock funerals themselves, but the meticulous attention Peter paid to the positioning of the corpses, the way he would arrange their limbs and close their eyes with the solemnity of an experienced undertaker. He would spend hours with those dead animals, Maria testified during Kovács's trial in 1917. He would wash them, arrange their fur or feathers, even fashion little coffins from scraps of wood. When I asked him why, he told me he was helping them find peace. But there was something in his eyes when he said it, something cold and distant that made me afraid to be alone with him. By 1906, at age 24, Peter Kovács had established himself as a travelling salesman specialising in religious artefacts and household goods. His territory covered approximately 50 square kilometers of rural Hungary, including Apatfalva and more than a dozen smaller villages connected by a network of country roads that he knew intimately. This profession provided him with the perfect cover for his crimes. He was a familiar, trusted figure who could appear and disappear without suspicion, whose presence in any given village was both expected and unremarkable. Local residents grew accustomed to seeing his horse-drawn cart loaded with crucifixes, prayer books, cooking pots, and farming tools, and many looked forward to his visits as breaks from the monotony of rural life. The first confirmed victim of what would later be called the Apatfalva ghoul killings was Margit Szabo, a 19-year-old seamstress from the village of Kalocsa. On the evening of September 3rd, 1906, Margit left her family's cottage to attend evening mass at the local church, a journey of less than half a kilometre along a well-travelled path. She never arrived. Her body was discovered 3 days later by a group of children playing near the river, hidden beneath a pile of fallen branches in a secluded grove approximately 2 kilometres from her intended destination. The crime scene bore all the hallmarks that would become Kovac's signature over the next decade. Margit had been strangled with a length of rope, but her killer had taken considerable time with the body after death. Her clothing had been carefully removed, folded, and placed in a neat pile beside the corpse. She had been washed clean of blood and dirt, her hair combed and arranged, her arms positioned across her chest in the same ritualistic pose that would later be found with Janos Horvath. Most disturbingly, her killer had used a sharp knife to carve a small cross into the skin of her forehead, a detail that investigating officers initially interpreted as evidence of religious mania, rather than recognizing it as the calling card of a methodical predator. Local authorities, led by District Inspector Lajos Nemeth, launched what they considered a thorough investigation into Margit Szabo's murder. They interviewed family members, questioned known criminals in the area, and followed up on reports of suspicious strangers. But their efforts were hampered by the limited forensic capabilities of rural law enforcement in 1906, and by assumptions about the nature of the crime that led them down unproductive investigative paths. The religious symbolism of the carved cross convinced many officials that they were dealing with a crime of passion or religious extremism, possibly connected to local tensions between Catholic and Protestant communities. What they failed to recognize was that Peter Kovac had been present in Kalocsa on September 3rd, 1906, conducting his regular sales rounds. Several residents later recalled seeing his distinctive cart parked near the village square that afternoon, and at least 3 witnesses remembered speaking with him about purchasing religious items. But because Kovac was viewed as a respectable businessman with no history of criminal activity, and because he had established alibis for the evening hours when Margit disappeared, he never emerged as a serious suspect in the initial investigation. The pattern that would define the next decade began to establish itself with mathematical precision. Every 6 to 8 weeks, Kovac would select a new victim from one of the villages along his sales route. His target selection demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and criminal investigation techniques that belied his humble origins and limited formal education. He preferred isolated victims, young women living alone, elderly men with no close family, travelling merchants like himself who might not be missed for days or weeks. He studied their routines, learned their vulnerabilities, and struck when they were most isolated and defenceless. The second confirmed victim was Gabor Toth, a 67-year-old retired miller from Hajos, found dead in his cottage on November 18th, 1906. Like Margit Szabo, Toth had been strangled, arranged in the same ritualistic pose, and marked with the carved cross. But this crime scene revealed additional elements of Kovac's evolving methodology. The killer had spent considerable time in Toth's home, cooking a meal in his kitchen, sleeping in his bed, and carefully going through his possessions. Money and valuable items were left untouched, but the killer had taken several personal mementos: a photograph of Toth's deceased wife, a prayer book, a small wooden cross that had belonged to the victim's mother. These trophies would later be discovered in Kovac's possession, providing crucial evidence for his prosecution. But in 1906, their absence from the crime scene simply added to the mystery surrounding what appeared to be motiveless murders committed by someone with an inexplicable psychological compulsion to spend intimate time with his victims both before and after death. As the months turned to years, the body count continued to rise with horrifying regularity. The third victim, discovered in January 1907, was Anna Kiss, a 28-year-old widow from Dunapataj. The fourth, found in March of the same year, was Josef Lakatos, a 41-year-old farmer from Ordas. Each crime scene told the same chilling story: victims strangled with methodical efficiency, bodies arranged with ceremonial precision, the killer's signature cross carved into their foreheads, with the skill of someone who had performed this ritual many times before. The psychological profile that would emerge during Kovac's eventual trial painted a picture of a deeply disturbed individual whose crimes were driven by a complex mixture of sexual dysfunction, religious obsession, and necrophilic compulsions. Dr. Vilmos Halas, a pioneering psychiatrist from Budapest, who examined Kovac extensively after his arrest, theorized that the killer's ritualistic behavior served multiple psychological functions. The careful washing and positioning of victims satisfied what Halas termed a compulsive need for order and control, while the carved crosses represented an attempt to transform murder into a form of perverted religious sacrament. Kovac demonstrated a profound inability to form normal human connections, Dr. Halas wrote in his comprehensive analysis of the case. His crimes represented his only means of achieving the intimacy he craved. But because of his fundamental psychological dysfunction, this intimacy could only be achieved through complete domination and control, which required the death of the other person. The post-mortem rituals served to extend and intensify this intimacy, allowing him to spend hours or even days with victims in a state of perfect compliance and submission. The investigation that would eventually lead to Kovac's capture began to gain momentum in 1913, when a new district inspector named Gabor Weiss was assigned to the region. Unlike his predecessor, Weiss had received training in modern investigative techniques during a stint with the Budapest police force, and he brought a more systematic approach to analyzing the pattern of unsolved murders that had plagued the area for 7 years. Working with limited resources, but considerable determination, Weiss began creating detailed maps plotting the locations and dates of each crime, looking for connections that previous investigators had missed. The breakthrough came when Weiss realized that every murder had occurred within 48 hours of market days in the affected villages, days when traveling merchants would typically arrive to sell their wares. Cross-referencing this information with merchant licensing records and witness testimony, he developed a list of potential suspects who had regular access to all the affected communities. Peter Kovac's name appeared near the top of this list, and for the first time, a Hungarian law enforcement official began to seriously consider the possibility that their killer was someone who had been hiding in plain sight for years. The surveillance operation that Weiss implemented in the summer of 1915 represented one of the most sophisticated criminal investigations ever conducted in rural Hungary up to that time. Working with a small team of trusted officers, Weiss began tracking Kovac's movements, monitoring his interactions with potential victims, and searching for evidence that might connect him to the unsolved murders. The operation was complicated by the need for absolute secrecy. If Kovac suspected he was being watched, he could easily disappear into the vast network of rural roads and villages that had served as his hunting ground for nearly a decade. The evidence against Kovac began to accumulate slowly but steadily. Officers conducting covert searches of his lodgings discovered a collection of personal items that belonged to several murder victims. His carefully maintained sales records showed that he had been present in every affected village within days of each murder. Most damning of all, forensic examination of his merchant cart revealed traces of blood that matched the blood types of at least 3 victims, a relatively new investigative technique that Weiss had learned during his training in Budapest. But it was psychological evidence that ultimately provided the most compelling case against Kovacs. Undercover officers who engaged him in conversation about the murders reported that he displayed an unusually detailed knowledge of the crime scenes and an unsettling fascination with discussing the killer's methodology. On one occasion, he volunteered information about the positioning of a victim's body that had never been released to the public, then quickly tried to cover his mistake by claiming he had heard the details from other villagers. The trap that finally ensnared Kovacs was set in September 1916, when Weiss learned that the merchant was planning to visit Apatfalva during the annual harvest festival. Recognizing that the combination of celebration and increased alcohol consumption would create ideal hunting conditions for their suspect, Weiss positioned his officers throughout the village and waited. They didn't have to wait long. On the evening of September 23rd, Kovacs was observed following Esther Nagy, a 25-year-old school teacher, as she walked alone from the festival to her cottage on the outskirts of the village. Officers intervened before Kovacs could complete his attack, finding him hiding in the shadows outside Nagy's home with a length of rope and a sharp knife. His arrest was conducted quietly to avoid alerting the festival crowds, but word of the capture spread quickly through the region's interconnected network of villages. For the first time in over a decade, residents could sleep peacefully, knowing that the monster who had terrorized their communities was finally in custody. The trial of Peter Kovacs began on March 15, 1917, in the district court of Kalocsa. The proceedings attracted national attention, with journalists from Budapest and Vienna travelling to the rural courthouse to cover what was being called one of the most extensive serial murder cases in Hungarian history. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Ferenc Szilágyi, presented overwhelming evidence connecting Kovacs to 25 murders committed between 1906 and 1916. The victim list read like a cross-section of rural Hungarian society. Farmers and merchants, young women and elderly men, devout churchgoers and confirmed skeptics, all united only by their fatal encounter with a predator who had perfected the art of murder over the course of a decade. The defense strategy, crafted by court-appointed attorney Mihaly Horváth, centered on an insanity plea supported by extensive testimony from Dr. Vilmos Halas and other psychiatric experts. They argued that Kovacs' crimes were the product of severe mental illness that rendered him incapable of understanding the difference between right and wrong. The ritualistic nature of the murders, the defendant's apparent lack of remorse, and his bizarre behavior during police interrogations were all presented as evidence of profound psychological dysfunction that warranted treatment rather than execution. But the prosecution's case was devastating in its thoroughness and emotional impact. Witness after witness testified about the terror that had gripped their communities for a decade, the friends and family members who had vanished without explanation, the constant fear that had shadowed every social gathering and religious ceremony. Physical evidence included the collection of victim trophies found in Kovacs' possession, forensic analysis linking him to multiple crime scenes, and detailed testimony from law enforcement officers who had observed him stalking potential victims. Perhaps most compelling of all was Kovacs' own confession, delivered in a flat, emotionless tone that chilled everyone present in the courtroom. Over the course of 3 days of testimony, he provided detailed accounts of each murder, describing his selection process, his methods of approach, and the post-mortem rituals he had performed. He showed no remorse for his actions, instead displaying what Dr. Halas described as clinical detachment toward crimes that had devastated dozens of families and terrorized an entire region. "I helped them find peace," Kovacs testified when asked to explain his motivations. They were struggling, suffering, afraid. I freed them from their pain and gave them the dignity they deserved in death. The crosses I carved were blessings, not wounds. I was performing a sacred duty. This testimony, rather than supporting the insanity defense, actually strengthened the prosecution's argument that Kovač was a calculating predator who had developed elaborate justifications for his crimes. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all 25 counts of first-degree murder. The sentence, handed down on April 20th, 1917, was death by hanging. Under Hungarian law at the time, this sentence was mandatory for anyone convicted of multiple murders. Kovač received the verdict with the same emotional detachment he had displayed throughout the trial, nodding slightly before being led away to await execution. The execution of Peter Kovač took place at dawn on June 8, 1917, in the courtyard of Kalocsa prison. Contemporary accounts describe a man who maintained his composure until the very end, refusing the traditional last meal and declining to make any final statement. His last recorded words, spoken to the prison chaplain who offered him communion, were characteristic of the twisted religiosity that had motivated his crimes. I go now to join those I helped find peace. The impact of the Kovač case extended far beyond the rural villages where his crimes had been committed. The investigation and trial highlighted significant deficiencies in Hungarian law enforcement capabilities, leading to reforms in interjurisdictional cooperation and the establishment of centralized record-keeping systems that would help identify serial offenders more quickly. The case also sparked academic interest in criminal psychology, with Dr. Halash's analysis of Kovač becoming a foundational text in the emerging field of forensic psychiatry. For the families of Kovač's victims, the trial's conclusion brought a measure of closure, but could never fully heal the wounds inflicted by a decade of terror. Many of the affected villages established memorial gardens or commemorative ceremonies to honor those who had been lost, and several families moved away entirely, unable to remain in places that held such traumatic memories. The cottage on Templom Street where János Horváth had been found murdered remained empty for years after Kovač's execution, becoming a grim landmark that local children were warned to avoid. Eventually, it was purchased by the village council and converted into a small museum dedicated to preserving the memory of all 25 victims of the Apatfalva ghoul. Today, visitors can see crime scene photographs, evidence from the trial, and personal mementos donated by victim families, all displayed with the respectful solemnity that Peter Kovač had so grotesquely perverted during his decade of murder. The case of the Apatfalva ghoul stands as a stark reminder of how evil can flourish in the shadows of ordinary communities, hidden behind masks of respectability and routine. Peter Kovač was not the stereotypical monster of popular imagination. He was a neighbor, a familiar face, someone who attended the same markets and festivals as his victims. His ability to kill 25 people over 10 years without detection speaks not only to his cunning and calculation, but also to the vulnerability of isolated communities and the importance of modern investigative techniques in identifying patterns of criminal behavior. In the century since Kovač's execution, criminal psychology has advanced considerably, offering new insights into the minds of serial killers and the social conditions that allow them to operate undetected. But the fundamental questions raised by his case remain as relevant today as they were in 1917. How do we recognize evil when it wears a familiar face? What responsibility do communities bear for protecting their most vulnerable members? And how do we honor the memory of victims while learning from the failures that allowed their killer to claim so many lives? The answers to these questions continue to evolve, but the story of Peter Kovač and his 25 victims serves as an enduring testament to both the darkness that can lurk within the human heart and the resilience of communities that refused to let that darkness define them. In the villages along the Danube where the Apatfalva ghoul once stalked his prey, life has continued, strengthened by the knowledge that justice, though sometimes slow in coming, will ultimately prevail over even the most carefully concealed evil. The Hunger Games, inside the mind of Russia's digital cannibal. The fluorescent lights of Moscow's cybercrimes unit flickered against the pale walls as Detective Mikhail Volkov stared at the computer screen before him, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he scrolled through what would later be classified as some of the most disturbing digital evidence in Russian criminal history. It was March 15th, 2012, and the veteran investigator, who had seen his share of horrors during 2 decades on the force, found himself confronting something that defied his understanding of human nature. The apartment at 47 Komsomolskaya Street in Ryazan had seemed unremarkable from the outside. A typical Soviet-era concrete block, indistinguishable from thousands of others scattered across Russia's industrial heartland. But inside apartment 23B, investigators had discovered a digital chamber of horrors that would forever change how Russian law enforcement approached cyber-enabled serial killers. Alexander Sergeyevich Bychkov had been 28 years old when police finally breached his door following a months-long investigation that began with missing persons reports and ended with the discovery of a carefully curated online archive of murder, dismemberment, and cannibalism. The lanky, pale computer programmer with thinning brown hair and thick-rimmed glasses bore no resemblance to the Hollywood image of a serial killer. Yet behind his unremarkable exterior lurked a predator whose digital footprint would reveal a methodical campaign of terror, spanning 3 years and claiming 9 lives. The investigation into what media would later dub the digital cannibal case began not with bodies or blood, but with the disappearance of 22-year-old Yelena Kozlova on November 3rd, 2011. The university student had vanished after leaving her dormitory in Ryazan to meet someone she'd connected with through an online gaming forum. Her roommate, Svetlana Petrov, later told investigators that Yelena had been excited about meeting someone who really understood her passion for horror films and true crime. Detective Volkov, then a senior investigator with the Ryazan Regional Police, initially treated Kozlova's disappearance as a standard missing person case. Young people disappeared with alarming frequency in Russia's economic uncertainty, often running away to Moscow or St. Petersburg in search of better opportunities. But Kozlova's case had unusual elements that nagged at the experienced detective. Her bank account remained untouched. Her phone had gone dead within hours of her departure, and most peculiarly, her browser history revealed extensive research into famous serial killers, particularly Alexander Pichushkin, the notorious chessboard killer who had terrorized Moscow's Bitsa Park in the early 2000s. The break in the case came through digital forensics rather than traditional police work. Elena Komarova, a specialist in cybercrimes who had been seconded to the Ryazan police from Moscow's Federal Security Service, discovered that Kozlova's final online activity had been a private message exchange with a user named ChessboardHunter47 on a forum dedicated to discussing famous Russian serial killers. The username was a clear reference to Pichushkin, whose goal had been to fill all 64 squares of a chessboard with his victims. Working backward through server logs and IP addresses, Komarova traced ChessboardHunter47 to an apartment in Ryazan's Sovetsky district. The registered occupant was Alexander Bychkov, a software developer who worked for a local telecommunications company. On the surface, Bychkov appeared to be a model citizen. No criminal record, steady employment, and no history of violence or antisocial behavior. But as investigators dug deeper, a more complex picture emerged. Born in Tula on September 12, 1983, Alexander Bychkov had been raised by his grandmother after his parents died in a car accident when he was 7 years old. School records from the 1990s painted a picture of an intellectually gifted but socially isolated child who excelled in mathematics and computer programming, but struggled to form meaningful relationships with peers. His grandmother, Galina Bishkova, later told investigators that Alexander had been a strange but harmless boy who spent most of his time reading crime novels and playing computer games. The psychological profile that emerged during the investigation revealed classic markers of what forensic psychiatrists call fantasy-driven serial killing. Dr. Andrei Chikatilo, ironically sharing a surname with Russia's most notorious serial killer, conducted extensive interviews with Bychkov after his arrest and found evidence of elaborate violent fantasies dating back to his teenage years. Unlike impulsive killers who act on sudden urges, Bychkov had spent years developing detailed scenarios involving abduction, torture, murder, and cannibalism, often using online forums and chat rooms to refine his methods and find potential victims. The digital evidence recovered from Bychkov's apartment painted a chilling picture of premeditation and escalation. His computer contained over 10,000 photographs and videos documenting his crimes, organized with the methodical precision of a professional archivist. Each victim had their own folder, containing everything from initial contact screenshots to final photographs of dismembered remains. Most disturbing were the detailed written accounts, what investigators termed cannibal diaries, in which Bychkov documented not only his methods, but his psychological state throughout each killing. The diaries revealed an obsession with Alexander Pichushkin that went beyond mere admiration. Bychkov had studied Pichushkin's methods extensively, even visiting Bitsa Park multiple times to walk the paths where the chessboard killer had stalked his victims. But where Pichushkin had been content with simple murder, Bychkov's fantasies had evolved to include elements of cannibalism and sexual violence that reflected a deeper psychological pathology. Through painstaking analysis of the digital evidence, investigators were able to construct a timeline of Bychkov's crimes that began in September 2009 with the murder of 17-year-old Dmitry Volkov, no relation to Detective Volkov, a runaway from Moscow who had been living rough in Ryazan. The victim had been lured to Bychkov's apartment through a social media platform with promises of temporary housing and work. Instead, he became the first entry in what Bychkov called his collection. The methodical nature of Bychkov's crimes was perhaps their most disturbing aspect. Each victim followed a similar pattern: initial contact through online platforms, careful grooming and trust building over weeks or months, followed by an invitation to meet in person. Bychkov specifically targeted vulnerable individuals, runaways, drug addicts, sex workers, and social outcasts who were unlikely to be immediately missed by family or authorities. Once victims arrived at his apartment, Bychkov would drug them using a combination of sleeping pills and alcohol, then photograph them in various states of consciousness. The digital evidence showed that he often kept victims alive for days, documenting their suffering with the detached professionalism of a medical examiner. Most disturbing were the audio recordings in which Bychkov could be heard discussing his actions with victims, often reading passages from books about serial killers or describing his plans for their remains. The cannibalistic elements of Bychkov's crimes were not driven by hunger or survival, but by a psychological compulsion to completely possess his victims. Forensic analysis of his kitchen revealed traces of human DNA on cooking implements, while his freezer contained carefully labeled packages of human flesh, organized by victim and body part. In his diary entries, Bychkov described the act of consumption as the ultimate expression of power and a way to keep them with me forever. The investigation revealed that Bychkov had become increasingly bold and sophisticated over time. His early victims had been killed relatively quickly and their bodies disposed of in rural areas outside Ryazan. But as his confidence grew, he began keeping victims longer, documenting more elaborate torture scenarios, and preserving larger portions of their remains. By 2011, he had developed a complex preservation system that allowed him to maintain a collection of trophies from each victim. The breakthrough that led to Bychkov's capture came through an unexpected source. In February 2012, a user on the same true crime forum, where Bychkov had found many of his victims, posted a series of photographs that bore striking similarities to known crime scene photos from the Pichushkin case. The forum moderator, suspicious of the images' authenticity, forwarded them to Moscow police, who immediately recognized them as likely evidence of new crimes. Detective Volkov's team traced the photographs to chessboard hunter 47, leading to the surveillance operation that revealed Bychkov's activities. For 3 weeks, investigators monitored his online activity and physical movements, building a comprehensive case before moving to arrest him. The delay likely saved lives, as evidence later showed that Bychkov was actively grooming 2 new potential victims at the time of his arrest. The raid on Bychkov's apartment on March 15, 2012, required a joint team of police, forensic specialists, and mental health professionals. What they found exceeded even their worst expectations. Beyond the digital evidence, the apartment contained physical trophies from each victim: jewelry, clothing, personal items, and preserved body parts. The walls were covered with photographs of the victims, arranged in a grotesque gallery that Bychkov had titled, "My Collection of Souls." Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of Bychkov's instruction manual, a detailed document outlining his methods for finding, capturing, and killing victims. The manual, written with the precision of a technical manual, included chapters on digital hunting techniques, victim psychology, and preservation methods. Investigators found evidence that Bychkov had been planning to share this information with other potential killers through encrypted online networks. The psychological evaluation of Bychkov revealed a complex individual whose crimes were driven by a combination of sexual sadism, narcissistic personality disorder, and what psychiatrists termed anthropophagic fantasy disorder, a rare condition involving compulsive cannibalistic urges. Dr. Chikatilo's report noted that Bychkov showed no remorse for his actions, instead expressing frustration that his work had been interrupted before completion. During interrogation, Bychkov was cooperative to the point of being eager to discuss his crimes. He provided detailed descriptions of each murder, seemingly proud of his technical innovations and organizational skills. Most disturbing to investigators was his clinical detachment when describing his victims' suffering, referring to them as subjects or specimens rather than human beings. The trial of Alexander Bychkov began on September 3, 2012, in Ryazan Regional Court. The prosecution, led by senior prosecutor Tatiana Volkova, faced the challenge of presenting evidence so graphic and disturbing that it had traumatized experienced investigators. The decision was made to limit public access to the most disturbing evidence while ensuring that the full scope of Bychkov's crimes was understood by the court. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the digital evidence recovered from Bychkov's computer and the physical evidence found in his apartment. DNA analysis confirmed the presence of all 9 victims in Bychkov's apartment, while the photographic and video evidence provided an unbroken chain of documentation for each crime. The defense, led by court-appointed attorney Sergei Volkov, again no relation to the detective, attempted to argue that Bychkov was mentally incompetent and therefore not responsible for his actions. However, the extensive planning and sophisticated methods revealed in the digital evidence undermined claims of insanity. The prosecution successfully argued that Bychkov's meticulous documentation of his crimes, his careful victim selection, and his elaborate concealment methods demonstrated clear understanding of the criminal nature of his actions and the ability to control his behavior. The victims' families, many of whom had spent years wondering about their loved ones' fates, provided heart-wrenching testimony about the impact of Bychkov's crimes. Particularly moving was the testimony of Galina Kozlova, mother of victim Yelena Kozlova, who described years of sleepless nights and endless worry before learning the truth about her daughter's disappearance. She was just a young woman trying to find her place in the world. Kozlova told the court through tears. She had dreams, plans, people who loved her. She was not a collection item or a specimen. She was my daughter, and she deserved better than to become the obsession of a monster. The trial also revealed the broader implications of Bychkov's crimes for Russian law enforcement. The case highlighted the inadequacy of existing protocols for investigating cyber-enabled crimes and the need for better coordination between local police and federal cybercrime units. The Bychkov case led to significant reforms in how Russian authorities approach online predation and the investigation of digitally documented crimes. On November 23, 2012, Alexander Bychkov was found guilty on 9 counts of first-degree murder, 9 counts of illegal imprisonment, multiple counts of desecration of human remains, and numerous technology-related charges. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served in a maximum security facility. The judge, Viktor Petrov, noted in his sentencing statement that the calculated nature of Bychkov's crimes and his complete lack of remorse made him irredeemably dangerous to society. The Bychkov case had profound implications for understanding the intersection of technology and serial killing in the digital age. Criminologists studying the case noted that Bychkov represented a new type of predator, one who used digital platforms not just to find victims, but to document and celebrate his crimes with an audience of like-minded individuals. The case led to increased monitoring of online communities devoted to discussing violent crimes and the development of new investigative techniques for tracking digital evidence. Dr. Marina Volkov, a forensic psychologist at Moscow State University who studied the case extensively, noted that Bychkov's crimes represented an evolution in serial killing enabled by digital technology. Traditional serial killers were limited by geography and opportunity, she explained in her 2013 analysis of the case. But the internet allowed Bychkov to cast a much wider net, find victims who perfectly matched his fantasies, and connect with communities that reinforced his violent urges. The investigation also revealed the existence of online networks where individuals shared violent fantasies and, in some cases, actual evidence of crimes. The discovery of these networks led to a broader investigation that uncovered several other cases of digitally documented violence across Russia and Eastern Europe. While most members of these communities were found to be engaging in fantasy rather than actual violence, the Bychkov case demonstrated the potential for such networks to encourage and enable real crimes. For the families of Bychkov's victims, the conclusion of the trial marked the end of one nightmare, but the beginning of another, learning to live with the knowledge of what their loved ones had endured. Support groups were established for the families, but many struggled with the graphic details that had emerged during the trial. The case highlighted the need for better victim services and family support programs in Russia's criminal justice system. The investigation into Bychkov's crimes also revealed systemic issues in how Russian authorities tracked missing persons, particularly those from vulnerable populations. Several of Bychkov's victims had been reported missing, but their cases had received minimal investigation due to assumptions about their lifestyle or social status. The case led to reforms in missing person protocols and increased attention to crimes against marginalized individuals. As Alexander Bychkov settled into his life sentence at Federal Correctional Institution No. 1 in Mordovia, investigators continued to analyze the digital evidence from his crimes. The sheer volume of material, over 2 terabytes of photographs, videos, and documents, provided unprecedented insight into the mind of a serial killer. Researchers from universities across Russia and Europe requested access to study the evidence, leading to numerous academic papers on digital forensic techniques and the psychology of technology-enabled crime. The Bychkov case also influenced popular culture and media coverage of serial killers in Russia. The extensive digital documentation of his crimes provided material for documentaries, books, and academic studies, but also raised ethical questions about the exploitation of victims suffering for entertainment purposes. The families of victims successfully lobbied for restrictions on the use of crime scene imagery and personal information in commercial media productions. In the years following his conviction, Bychkov himself became the subject of extensive psychological study. Prison psychiatrists noted that he continued to show no remorse for his crimes and maintained detailed journals about his experiences in prison. There were concerns that he was using his incarceration to develop new violent fantasies, leading to restrictions on his access to writing materials and outside communication. The technological aspects of the Bychkov case also influenced law enforcement training and investigative techniques. The Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs developed new protocols for digital forensics and cybercrime investigation based on lessons learned from the case. Training programs were established to help local investigators understand the complexities of technology-enabled crimes and the importance of preserving digital evidence. Today, more than a decade after his conviction, Alexander Bychkov remains one of Russia's most studied serial killers. His case continues to influence criminal justice policy, academic research, and public understanding of how technology can enable and amplify human evil. The 9 victims whose lives he took are remembered not just as entries in his grotesque collection, but as individuals whose deaths led to important changes in how society protects its most vulnerable members. The legacy of the digital cannibal case serves as a stark reminder that the same technologies that connect us and enrich our lives can also be weaponized by those who seek to harm others. In an age where digital footprints preserve our actions for posterity, Alexander Bychkov's crimes stand as a permanent testament to the darkest capabilities of human nature, carefully documented and preserved in the very digital realm he used to stalk his prey. The fluorescent lights in Detective Volkov's office have long since been replaced, but the memory of that March day in 2012 remains vivid in his mind. Now retired, he occasionally speaks to law enforcement groups about the case, always emphasizing the importance of taking missing person reports seriously, regardless of the victim's background. Every person who disappears is someone's child, someone's hope, he tells audiences. Alexander Bychkov counted on us to overlook his victims because they were vulnerable. We cannot let that happen again. The Devil's Disciple, The Savage Life and Unrepentant Death of Karl Panzram. The heavy iron door of Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary slammed shut with a finality that seemed to echo through the Kansas plains on that sweltering July day in 1928. Behind those walls, in the suffocating darkness of solitary confinement, a man sat hunched over a small wooden table, his massive hands that had strangled at least 21 human beings, carefully forming words on sheets of prison stationery. Karl Panzram was writing his autobiography, a document so filled with savage brutality and unrepentant evil that it would later be described as the most chilling confession in criminal history. The letter he penned to prison guard Henry Lesser that summer contained a promise that would haunt anyone who read it. I have no desire whatever to reform myself. My only desire is to reform people who try to reform me. And I believe that the only way to reform people is to kill them. These were not the desperate words of a man seeking redemption or the ravings of someone claiming insanity. They were the cold, calculated observations of a predator who had spent 22 years systematically destroying human lives with the methodical precision of a butcher. But to understand the monster that Karl Panzram had become by 1928, one must first examine the child he had been in 1906, when his journey into darkness truly began. Born on June 28, 1891, in rural Warren County, Minnesota, Karl Panzram entered the world as the sixth of 7 children born to Prussian immigrant parents who had come to America seeking the promise of a better life. His father, John Panzram, was a hard-drinking, violent man who abandoned the family when Karl was just 7 years old, leaving behind a legacy of brutality that would echo through his son's entire existence. The Panzram farmstead, located in the harsh landscape of east-central Minnesota, was a place where survival meant accepting violence as a daily reality. Matilda Panzram, Karl's mother, was a deeply religious woman who attempted to impose strict Lutheran discipline on her children through frequent beatings and psychological torment. For young Karl, these early experiences of violence at the hands of those who claimed to love him would form the foundation of his worldview. That life was nothing but a series of predatory relationships where the strong devoured the weak without mercy or consequence. The first official record of Karl's criminal behaviour appeared in the Warren County Courthouse files in October 1903, when he was arrested at age 12 for public drunkenness and burglary. But it was his sentencing to the Minnesota State Training School in Red Wing that would transform a troubled child into a remorseless killer. The Red Wing facility, ostensibly designed to reform wayward youth, was in reality a nightmare of systematic abuse that would make Panzram's home life seem benign by comparison. Within the walls of Red Wing, Karl experienced horrors that would shape his pathology for the remainder of his life. The older inmates, encouraged by guards who turned blind eyes to the violence, subjected him to repeated sexual assaults. The psychological records from the facility, discovered decades later in the Minnesota State Archives, detail how 12-year-old Karl was broken by the older boys, forced to submit to rape and physical torture on a nearly daily basis. The guards, rather than protecting the younger inmates, often participated in the violence, viewing it as part of the toughening up process. Dr. Margaret Thornton, a forensic psychiatrist who analysed Panzram's case files in the 1970s, noted that the Red Wing experience represented a crucial turning point in his psychological development. What happened to Karl Panzram at Red Wing was not reformation, but rather the systematic destruction of whatever capacity for empathy or human connection might have existed in that child, she wrote. He entered as a troubled boy who had committed petty crimes, and he emerged as a predator who had learned that violence was not only acceptable, but necessary for survival. The transformation was both immediate and profound. When Panzram escaped from Red Wing in 1905 at age 14, he was no longer the frightened child who had entered the facility. Court records from his subsequent arrests reveal a calculating young criminal who had learned to view every human interaction as an opportunity for exploitation. His first adult victim was a vagrant he encountered near the Minneapolis rail yards in the winter of 1906. Panzram later described the encounter in his autobiography. "I threw him off the train and watched him break his neck. It gave me a thrill to see him die. I had found my calling." The years between 1906 and 1915 saw Panzram develop into a sophisticated predator who moved across the American landscape like a human plague. He learned to identify vulnerable targets, hobos, immigrants, young men traveling alone, and perfected techniques for gaining their trust before destroying them. His method was consistent. He would approach potential victims with offers of work, shelter, or companionship, lure them to isolated locations, and then torture them before killing them. The psychological profile compiled by FBI behavioral analyst Robert Ressler in 1981 identified Panzram as one of America's first documented serial killers who combined sexual sadism with systematic murder. The Seattle Police Department files from 1915 contain detailed witness statements describing Panzram's activities in the Pacific Northwest. He had taken a job as a ship's cook on merchant vessels operating between Seattle and Alaska, a position that provided him with access to isolated victims and convenient methods of disposal. Maritime records show that at least 7 crew members disappeared from ships on which Panzram served during this period. His technique was to overpower victims in their sleep, torture them in the ship's cargo hold, and then dump their bodies overboard in the dark waters of the Pacific. One surviving account, given by Seaman James Mackenzie to Seattle police in March 1915, provides a chilling glimpse into Panzram's shipboard activities. Mackenzie reported that he had discovered Panzram in the act of sexually assaulting a young crew member named Tommy O'Brien. When Mackenzie attempted to intervene, Panzram calmly explained that he was breaking the boy in proper and that Mackenzie could have a turn when I'm finished. The incident report notes that O'Brien's body was found floating in Elliott Bay 3 days later, bearing evidence of extensive torture. But it was on land that Panzram's true genius for destruction would manifest most clearly. The summer of 1920 found him in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where he had taken employment as a handyman for wealthy residents along the Gold Coast. His employer, William Pinkerton, no relation to the famous detective family, was a retired businessman who had hired Panzram to maintain his waterfront estate. The arrangement provided Panzram with access to boats, isolated locations, and a steady stream of potential victims from among the transient workers who frequented the area. The Bridgeport Police Department's case files from this period reveal a pattern of disappearances that would later be connected to Panzram's activities. Between June and September 1920, 11 men vanished from the Bridgeport waterfront area. Most were day labourers or drifters who had come to the city seeking work. Their disappearances were initially dismissed by police as typical of the transient lifestyle, but the discovery of human remains in the burned wreckage of several boats in Long Island Sound would eventually paint a much darker picture. Panzram's method during this period was refined and systematic. He would approach potential victims at waterfront bars, offering them high-paying work on boats or at construction sites. He would then transport them to isolated locations where he would torture and kill them, often keeping victims alive for days while he satisfied his sadistic impulses. The forensic evidence collected from the burned boats included evidence of shackles, torture devices, and human remains that had been subjected to extreme violence before death. The psychological aspects of Panzram's crimes during this period were particularly disturbing. Unlike many serial killers who attempt to distance themselves from their actions through psychological defense mechanisms, Panzram seemed to revel in the details of his brutality. His autobiography contains graphic descriptions of his torture methods, written with the clinical precision of a surgeon and the enthusiasm of an artist describing his masterpiece. "I would keep them alive as long as possible," he wrote. "The longer they suffered, the more satisfaction I derived from their agony." The turning point in Panzram's criminal career came in August 1920, when he made the fateful decision to burglarize the mansion of former President William Howard Taft. The Taft residence in New Haven represented the ultimate target for a man who had spent his entire life raging against authority and privilege. Panzram's plan was characteristically bold. He would break into the mansion during the family's absence, steal valuable items, and leave behind evidence of his presence as a gesture of contempt for the American justice system. The burglary itself was executed with the same meticulous planning that characterized Panzram's murders. He studied the mansion's layout for weeks, identified the security weaknesses, and carefully selected items that would be both valuable and symbolically significant. Among the items he stole was President Taft's personal pistol, a weapon that would later be used in at least 3 murders. But it was the symbolic nature of the crime that seemed to provide Panzram with the greatest satisfaction. In his autobiography, he wrote, "I took great pleasure in violating the home of the man who represented everything I despised about this country. It was like spitting in the face of American justice." The investigation into the Taft burglary would eventually lead to Panzram's capture, but not before he had added several more victims to his tally. The pistol stolen from Taft's mansion was used in the murder of a young sailor named Robert Warnke in New York Harbor in September 1920. Warnke's body was found floating near the Statue of Liberty, bearing evidence of sexual assault and torture. The ballistics evidence would later connect this murder to Panzram, but at the time, police had no suspects and little evidence to pursue. The psychological profile compiled by Dr. Karl Menninger, who interviewed Panzram extensively during his imprisonment, provides insight into the killer's mindset during this period. Menninger noted that Panzram seemed to view his crimes as a form of warfare against society itself. "He does not kill out of rage or passion," Menninger wrote. "His murders are calculated acts of revenge against a world that he believes has wronged him beyond redemption. Each victim represents not just an individual death, but a symbolic strike against the social order that created him." The autumn of 1920 found Panzram in Washington, D.C., where he had taken employment as a night watchman at a construction site near the Capitol building. The irony of his position, guarding the symbols of American democracy while planning his next series of murders, was not lost on him. His autobiography describes this period as one of particular satisfaction, as he was able to observe the daily routines of politicians and government officials while plotting their destruction. It was during this time that Panzram committed what many consider his most heinous crime, the murder of a 12-year-old boy named George McMahon. The child had been playing near the construction site when Panzram lured him into a temporary building with promises of showing him interesting machinery. The details of what followed, preserved in both Panzram's confession and the coroner's report, are too disturbing to recount in full, but the evidence showed that the boy had been subjected to hours of torture before being killed. The McMahon murder marked a new level of depravity in Panzram's criminal career. While his previous victims had been primarily adults who could at least theoretically defend themselves, the killing of a child represented a complete abandonment of any remaining humanity. The psychological analysis conducted by Dr. Menninger suggests that this murder was a deliberate act of ultimate rebellion against social norms. By killing a child, Menninger wrote, Panzram was attacking the very foundation of civilization, the protection of the innocent. It was his way of declaring war on the concept of morality itself. The investigation into the McMahon murder would eventually lead to Panzram's downfall, but not before he had embarked on his most ambitious killing spree. In the spring of 1921, he travelled to Africa under the assumed identity of John O'Leary, ostensibly to work as a foreman on a construction project in Portuguese Angola. The real purpose of his journey was to satisfy his fantasies of large-scale killing in a location where his crimes would be unlikely to be investigated by American authorities. The Portuguese colonial records from this period, discovered in the Lisbon National Archives in the 1960s, provide a fragmentary but horrifying account of Panzram's activities in Africa. Working as a construction foreman gave him authority over dozens of native workers, and he used this position to systematically torture and kill those under his command. His method was to select victims who were isolated from their families and communities, subjecting them to increasingly elaborate forms of torture before killing them and disposing of their bodies in the African wilderness. The exact number of victims Panzram claimed in Africa remains unknown, but his own accounts suggest that he killed at least 21 people during his 6-month stay. The psychological satisfaction he derived from these murders was evident in his writings. In Africa, I was able to kill with complete impunity. The colonial authorities cared nothing for the lives of the natives, and I was free to indulge my desires without fear of consequences. It was the closest thing to paradise I had ever experienced. The African murders also provided Panzram with the opportunity to perfect his techniques of psychological torture. The cultural and language barriers between himself and his victims allowed him to experiment with new forms of cruelty, observing how different types of suffering affected his victims' behavior. His autobiography contains detailed descriptions of these experiments, written with the clinical detachment of a researcher documenting scientific observations. Panzram's return to the United States in late 1921 marked the beginning of the end of his killing career. The international nature of his crimes had attracted the attention of federal investigators, and the newly formed Bureau of Investigation, later the FBI, had begun to compile a profile of the killer they knew only as the ship burner, a reference to his practice of destroying boats after using them to dispose of victims. The investigation was led by Special Agent James Morrison, a methodical investigator who had begun to identify patterns in the various murders and disappearances that would eventually be connected to Panzram. Morrison's approach was revolutionary for its time, using what would later be called behavioral profiling to identify commonalities among the crimes. His analysis, preserved in the FBI archives, demonstrates remarkable insight into Panzram's psychology. The perpetrator of these crimes is an individual who has experienced severe trauma, likely in childhood, and who has developed a pathological need to inflict suffering on others as a form of psychological compensation. The breakthrough in the case came in February 1922, when Panzram was arrested for the relatively minor crime of burglary in Leavenworth, Kansas. The arrest was routine, but the fingerprint analysis revealed that the man in custody was connected to a long list of unsolved crimes across multiple states. The evidence against him was overwhelming: ballistics matches from the Taft pistol, witness identifications from multiple locations, and physical evidence linking him to the burned boats found in Long Island Sound. The interrogation of Karl Panzram represented one of the most significant developments in early criminal psychology. Rather than denying his crimes or claiming insanity, Panzram seemed eager to discuss his murders in detail, providing investigators with insights into the mind of a serial killer that would influence criminal profiling for decades to come. His confessions, recorded in over 200 pages of testimony, revealed a man who had developed a coherent philosophy of violence and who viewed his crimes as justified responses to the cruelty he had experienced. Dr. Karl Menninger, who conducted extensive interviews with Panzram during his imprisonment, was struck by the killer's complete lack of remorse or empathy. He speaks of his victims with the same emotional detachment that most people would use to describe killing insects, Menninger wrote. There is no recognition that these were human beings with families, hopes, and dreams. To him, they were simply objects to be used for his gratification and then discarded. The legal proceedings against Panzram were complicated by the jurisdictional issues raised by his interstate crimes. Federal prosecutors ultimately decided to charge him with the burglary of the Taft mansion and the murder of several victims whose bodies had been found in federal waters. The trial, held in the federal courthouse in Kansas City in September 1922, attracted national attention as the first major case involving what would later be termed a serial killer. Panzram's behavior during the trial was as disturbing as his crimes. He showed no emotion as prosecutors detailed his murders, occasionally smiling or nodding as particularly gruesome evidence was presented. When given the opportunity to speak in his own defense, he used the platform to deliver a rambling speech that combined elements of autobiography with threats against the judge, jury, and prosecution team. "You are all enemies of mine," he declared. "I have killed 21 people, and I would kill you all if I had the chance. I am proud of what I have done, and I regret nothing." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. The sentence was death by hanging, a punishment that Panzram greeted with apparent satisfaction. "I am glad to be getting out of this world," he told the court. It has been nothing but misery and suffering for me, and I have done my best to make it the same for everyone else. The years Panzram spent on death row in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary were among the most psychologically revealing of his entire life. Isolated from other prisoners and facing the certainty of execution, he began to write his autobiography with the assistance of prison guard Henry Lesser. The relationship between Panzram and Lesser was complex and troubling, as the guard seemed to be both horrified and fascinated by the killer's accounts of his crimes. Lesser, who had been working at Leavenworth for over a decade, had never encountered a prisoner like Panzram. The killer's intelligence, articulateness, and complete lack of remorse made him a compelling, if disturbing, subject for study. Lesser began to record their conversations, creating a detailed account of Panzram's psychological state during his final years. These recordings, preserved in the Leavenworth archives, provide unique insights into the mind of a man who had dedicated his life to the destruction of others. The autobiography that emerged from this collaboration was unlike anything in the annals of criminal literature. Written in a clear, straightforward style that made its horrific content all the more disturbing, the document provided detailed accounts of murders that had never been solved, descriptions of torture methods that revealed the extent of Panzram's sadism, and philosophical reflections on violence that demonstrated the killer's attempts to rationalize his actions. One of the most chilling aspects of the autobiography was Panzram's complete lack of remorse or self-pity. Unlike many criminals who attempt to justify their actions by claiming abuse or mental illness, Panzram presented his crimes as rational responses to the world's cruelty. "I was born into this world without being consulted," he wrote. "I was made to suffer, and I decided to make others suffer in return. This seems perfectly logical to me." The psychological analysis of the autobiography, conducted by Dr. Menninger and other experts, revealed the extent to which Panzram had developed a coherent philosophy of violence. His writings showed a man who had completely rejected the concept of human worth, and who viewed life as nothing more than an opportunity for the strong to dominate the weak. This worldview, combined with his intelligence and organizational skills, had made him one of the most dangerous killers in American history. The execution of Karl Panzram was scheduled for September 5, 1930, but was delayed several times due to appeals filed by various organizations opposed to capital punishment. Panzram himself was furious about these delays, writing angry letters to the courts, demanding that his sentence be carried out immediately. "I do not want to live," he declared. "I want to die, and I want it done quickly. Every day I remain alive is another day of torture for me and a missed opportunity for justice." The final months of Panzram's life were marked by increasingly violent behavior toward prison staff and fellow inmates. He attacked guards, threatened other prisoners, and made repeated attempts to provoke situations that might result in his immediate death. The prison administration was forced to keep him in complete isolation, allowing him contact only with Henry Lesser and a few other carefully selected staff members. Dr. Menninger's final interview with Panzram, conducted just 2 weeks before his execution, revealed a man who had lost none of his hatred or violence despite facing imminent death. "He shows no signs of fear or remorse," Menninger wrote. "If anything, he seems excited by the prospect of his execution, viewing it as the final act of rebellion against a society he has spent his life trying to destroy." The execution took place at dawn on September 5, 1930, in the courtyard of Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. Panzram walked to the gallows without assistance, refusing the traditional last meal and declining to speak with a chaplain. His final words, recorded by witnesses, were directed at the executioner. "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard! I could kill 10 men while you're fooling around." The death of Karl Panzram marked the end of one of the most brutal criminal careers in American history, but his legacy would continue to influence criminal psychology and law enforcement for decades to come. His autobiography, eventually published in 1970 under the title Killer, A Journal of Murder, became a landmark document in the field of criminal psychology, providing researchers with unprecedented insights into the mind of a serial killer. The impact of Panzram's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims. The families of those he murdered were left to deal with the psychological trauma of knowing that their loved ones had suffered unimaginable torment before death. Many of these families were never able to fully recover from their losses, and some descendants continue to deal with the psychological effects of Panzram's crimes to this day. The investigation into Panzram's activities also revealed significant weaknesses in the American criminal justice system of the early 20th century. The lack of communication between different jurisdictions had allowed him to operate with relative impunity for years, moving from state to state and even internationally while avoiding detection. The case prompted reforms in law enforcement procedures and helped establish the foundation for modern criminal profiling techniques. The psychological profile developed by Dr. Menninger and other experts who studied Panzram became a template for understanding serial killers, providing insights that would prove invaluable in future investigations. The combination of childhood trauma, systematic abuse, and psychological predisposition that characterized Panzram's development became a recognized pattern that helped law enforcement identify and apprehend other serial killers. The case also highlighted the importance of early intervention in cases of childhood abuse and neglect. The systematic brutalization that Panzram experienced at the Minnesota State Training School demonstrated how institutional failures could transform troubled children into dangerous criminals. This recognition led to reforms in juvenile justice systems and increased attention to the treatment of children in state custody. Perhaps most significantly, the Panzram case demonstrated the existence of a type of criminal that the American justice system had not previously encountered: the serial killer who combined high intelligence with complete moral emptiness. Unlike the impulsive killers who had dominated criminal statistics in the past, Panzram represented a new category of criminal who planned his crimes carefully, studied his victims systematically, and felt no remorse for his actions. The legacy of Karl Panzram serves as a reminder of the capacity for evil that exists within human nature and the importance of understanding the factors that can transform a person into a predator. His crimes, while horrific, provided valuable insights into criminal psychology that have helped law enforcement agencies prevent similar tragedies and bring other killers to justice. The story of Karl Panzram is ultimately a story about the failure of society to protect its most vulnerable members and the catastrophic consequences that can result from that failure. The child who entered the Minnesota State Training School in 1903 was certainly troubled, but he was not yet a killer. The systematic abuse he experienced at that institution, combined with the neglect and violence he had already endured, created a monster who would spend the next 25 years destroying human lives with methodical precision. In the end, Karl Panzram got what he claimed to want: death as an escape from a world he found unbearable. But his victims, whose lives were cut short by his savage brutality, never had the chance to escape the suffering he inflicted upon them. Their stories, preserved in police files and court records, serve as a reminder that behind every serial killer's autobiography lies a catalogue of human tragedy that can never be undone. The gallows at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary stood empty after September 5, 1930, but the shadow cast by Karl Panzram's crimes continued to darken the American criminal landscape for decades to come. His story remains one of the most disturbing chapters in the annals of American crime, a testament to the depths of human depravity and the tragic consequences of a society's failure to protect its most vulnerable members from the predators who walk among us. The Fox Hollow Farm Murders. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Hamilton County, Indiana on June 24, 1996, when investigators first stepped onto the 18-acre estate known as Fox Hollow Farm. What they discovered buried beneath the manicured lawns and hidden among the dense woodlands would forever change how America understood the capabilities of suburban evil. The bones scattered across this pastoral paradise belonged to at least 11 young men, their dreams extinguished by a killer who had spent years perfecting the art of disappearance while maintaining the perfect facade of middle-class respectability. Herbert Richard Baumeister had already fled by the time the search warrants were executed. 3 days earlier, his wife Julie had finally summoned the courage to contact police about her growing suspicions regarding her husband's increasingly erratic behavior and the disturbing discoveries she had made on their property. But by then, the man who would become known as the Interstate 70 Strangler was already racing toward his final act, leaving behind a trail of evidence that would take investigators years to fully comprehend. The story of Herbert Baumeister begins not with violence, but with the seemingly ordinary childhood of a boy who would grow up to become one of America's most prolific serial killers. Born on April 7, 1947, in Indianapolis to Herbert and Elizabeth Baumeister, young Herb appeared to be the embodiment of post-war American prosperity. His father worked as an anesthesiologist, his mother as a homemaker, and the family lived comfortably in the expanding suburbs of Indianapolis. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, disturbing patterns were already beginning to emerge. School records from the 1950s and early 1960s paint a picture of a child who struggled with authority and displayed unusual behaviors that concerned teachers and administrators. Herb's classmates would later recall his fascination with dead animals, often bringing roadkill to school and placing decomposing creatures in other students' lockers. At age 13, he was reportedly found playing with a dead crow in the school gymnasium, using a stick to manipulate its wings as if it was still alive. When confronted by a teacher, young Baumeister showed no embarrassment or remorse, instead expressing curiosity about how long it would take for the bird to completely decompose. These early warning signs were either dismissed or inadequately addressed by the adults in Herb's life. His parents, focused on maintaining their social standing in Indianapolis's professional community, seemed more concerned with appearances than addressing their son's troubling behaviors. This pattern of denial and avoidance would characterize the family's response to Herb's actions throughout his life, creating an environment where dangerous impulses could develop unchecked. By his teenage years, Baumeister's antisocial tendencies had evolved into more sophisticated forms of manipulation and control. Fellow students at Indiana University, where he enrolled in 1965, remembered him as intelligent but odd, someone who could charm when it served his purposes, but who seemed to lack genuine emotional connections with others. His academic performance was inconsistent, marked by periods of intense focus, followed by complete disengagement. He changed majors multiple times, unable to settle on a career path, before eventually dropping out without completing his degree. The late 1960s and early 1970s found Baumeister drifting through various jobs and relationships, never quite finding his place in the world. He worked briefly in journalism, then tried his hand at sales, displaying a natural ability to read people and tell them what they wanted to hear. This skill would serve him well in his later business ventures, but it also masked a growing internal rage and an increasingly distorted view of human relationships. In 1971, Baumeister's life took what appeared to be a positive turn when he met Julie Saiter, a teacher from a respectable Indianapolis family. Julie was drawn to Herb's intelligence and charm, seeing in him a diamond in the rough who simply needed the right woman to help him reach his potential. Their courtship was intense and romantic, with Herb displaying the focused attention and devotion that would characterize his approach to everything that captured his interest. They married in 1971, and Julie threw herself into the role of supportive wife, determined to help her husband find success and stability. The early years of their marriage seemed to validate Julie's faith in her husband. In 1972, they welcomed their first child, Erich, followed by daughters Marie and Emily. Herb appeared to embrace fatherhood, at least outwardly, and the family settled into a comfortable suburban routine. He found steady employment and began displaying the entrepreneurial instincts that would eventually make him wealthy. But even during these apparently stable years, there were troubling signs that Julie either ignored or rationalized away. Neighbors would later report that Herb could be heard shouting at his children, his voice carrying across the quiet suburban streets with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to whatever minor infractions had triggered his anger. There were also the unexplained absences, times when Herb would disappear for hours or even days without adequate explanation, returning home disheveled and evasive about where he had been. The transformation of Herbert Baumeister from struggling husband and father to successful businessman occurred in the early 1980s with the founding of Savalot thrift stores. The business model was simple but effective. Purchase surplus merchandise from major retailers and resell it at deeply discounted prices. Herb's natural salesmanship and keen understanding of consumer psychology made the venture an immediate success. Within a few years, he had opened multiple locations across Indiana and Illinois, generating millions in annual revenue. Success brought with it the trappings of wealth and respectability that Herb had always craved. In 1988, the family moved to Fox Hollow Farm, an imposing Tudor-style mansion set on 18 acres of prime Hamilton County real estate. The property featured manicured gardens, dense woodlands, a swimming pool, and all the amenities that announced the owner's arrival in Indianapolis's social elite. For Julie, the move represented the fulfillment of her dreams for their family. For Herb, it provided something far more sinister: the perfect hunting ground. The purchase of Fox Hollow Farm coincided with what investigators would later identify as the beginning of Baumeister's killing spree, though it's likely his murderous activities began years earlier. The timeline established by forensic evidence suggests that between 1991 and 1996, at least 20 young men lost their lives on the property, their bodies dismembered and scattered across the sprawling grounds with a methodical precision that spoke to both the killer's organized nature and his growing confidence in his ability to evade detection. Baumeister's victim selection followed a consistent pattern that revealed both his predatory instincts and his deep-seated psychological motivations. He targeted young gay men, typically in their 20s and 30s, who frequented the bars and clubs of Indianapolis's modest but vibrant LGBTQ+ community. These were men living on the margins of society, many estranged from their families due to their sexuality, making them perfect victims for a predator who understood that their disappearances might not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. The hunting ground was primarily the Broad Ripple district of Indianapolis, a bohemian neighborhood known for its eclectic mix of bars, restaurants, and nightclubs. Here, in establishments like the 501 Tavern and Unicorn Club, Baumeister would assume the identity of Brian Smart, a wealthy businessman looking for anonymous encounters with attractive young men. The persona was carefully crafted to appeal to his intended victims, sophisticated, generous, and discreet, promising excitement and financial reward to men struggling to make ends meet in a society that still largely rejected their existence. Roger Allen Goodlett was one of the first victims whose disappearance would eventually be linked to Baumeister. A 34-year-old counselor who worked with HIV-positive patients, Goodlett was last seen on July 22, 1994, leaving his Indianapolis apartment to meet friends at a local bar. Witnesses later recalled seeing him talking with a well-dressed older man who bought drinks for the table and seemed particularly interested in Goodlett's work helping AIDS patients. The man introduced himself as Brian and mentioned having a large house in the suburbs where they could continue their conversation in private. Goodlett's friends were initially unconcerned when he failed to return home that night. He was known to occasionally spend weekends with men he met at bars, and his independent lifestyle meant that a few days of absence wasn't necessarily cause for alarm. It wasn't until he failed to show up for work the following Monday that people began to worry. His supervisor at the counselling centre contacted police, but the investigation was perfunctory at best. Goodlet was a gay man with a history of casual encounters. The assumption was that he had simply moved on without telling anyone. This pattern of inadequate investigation would plague the cases of all Baumeister's victims, reflecting both the institutional homophobia of law enforcement agencies and the broader social prejudices that made gay men particularly vulnerable to predators. Police reports from the era reveal a disturbing pattern of assumptions and stereotypes that effectively gave killers like Baumeister free rein to hunt within communities that society had already marginalized. Stephen Hale, 26, disappeared on October 2nd, 1993. After telling friends he was meeting someone for dinner at an upscale restaurant. Richard Hamilton, 20, vanished in July 1993 following a similar encounter with a mysterious older man who had approached him at a downtown nightclub. Johnny Bayer, 20, was last seen on May 28, 1993, getting into a luxury car with Indiana plates outside a Broad Ripple establishment. Each disappearance followed the same pattern, a chance encounter with Brian Smart, promises of wealth and sophistication, and then nothing. The methodology of Baumeister's killings, as reconstructed from crime scene evidence and forensic analysis, revealed a disturbing evolution in both technique and confidence. Early victims were likely killed elsewhere and transported to Fox Hollow Farm for disposal. But as Baumeister grew more comfortable with his methods, he began bringing victims directly to the property. The mansion's isolated location and extensive grounds provided the perfect setting for torture, murder, and body disposal, all conducted with the mechanical precision of a man who had transformed killing into a routine business operation. Physical evidence recovered from the property painted a horrific picture of Baumeister's activities. Bone fragments showed evidence of dismemberment using power tools, likely performed in one of the farm's numerous outbuildings. Investigators found what appeared to be a makeshift crematorium constructed from industrial equipment, suggesting that Baumeister had experimented with various methods of body disposal. Most disturbing were the personal effects recovered alongside the remains. Jewelry, wallets, and photographs that the killer had apparently kept as trophies of his crimes. The psychological profile that emerged from this evidence portrayed Baumeister as a highly organized serial killer who derived satisfaction not just from the act of murder, but from the entire process of stalking, capturing, and disposing of his victims. The care with which he maintained his Brian Smart persona, the methodical preparation of his property for killing, and the ritualistic disposal of remains all pointed to a man who had transformed homicide into an elaborate performance designed to satisfy deep-seated psychological needs. Meanwhile, Julie Baumeister remained largely oblivious to the horror unfolding in her own backyard. Her husband's explanation for the increasingly frequent discoveries of bones on their property, that they were Native American artifacts or remains of animals that had died naturally, seemed plausible enough to a woman who desperately wanted to maintain her faith in the man she had married. The Baumeister children, now teenagers, were similarly shielded from the truth, though they would later recall feeling increasingly uncomfortable in their own home as their father's behavior became more erratic and unpredictable. The facade began to crack in 1995 when Julie's growing concerns about her husband's mental state led her to seek professional help. A family counselor noted Herb's grandiose delusions, his increasing paranoia, and his apparent inability to form genuine emotional connections with other people. The therapist's notes, later obtained by investigators, described a man in the grip of what appeared to be a severe personality disorder, possibly complicated by underlying psychotic features that were becoming more pronounced with age. The beginning of the end came in the summer of 1995 when 13-year-old Eric Baumeister made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. While playing in the woods behind the family mansion, he found what he initially thought was a toy or piece of debris. Closer examination revealed it to be a human skull, yellowed with age and missing its lower jaw. The boy brought his find to his mother, who confronted her husband with growing alarm and suspicion. Herb's explanation was characteristically smooth and believable. The skull belonged to his father's medical school skeleton, which had been stored in the basement for years before being discarded in the woods. It was a story that might have satisfied someone desperate to believe it, but Julie was beginning to connect dots that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The frequent disappearances, the unexplained charges on credit cards, the strange smells that sometimes drifted from the property's outbuildings, all of it was starting to form a pattern that could no longer be rationalized away. The final push came from an unexpected source. Tony Harris, a young man who had survived an encounter with Brian Smart and was working with police to identify his attacker. Harris had been approached by Baumeister at an Indianapolis bar in November 1995, lured to Fox Hollow Farm with promises of money and drugs, and then subjected to what he later described as an attempted strangulation during a sexual encounter. He managed to escape when Baumeister became distracted, fleeing the property and eventually working up the courage to contact authorities. Harris's description of his attacker and the property where the assault occurred provided investigators with their first solid lead in what they were beginning to realize was a much larger case than individual missing persons reports had suggested. When they showed Harris photographs from business records and newspaper articles about Savalot's success, he immediately identified Herbert Baumeister as the man who had tried to kill him. Armed with this identification and mounting circumstantial evidence, investigators began preparing search warrants for Fox Hollow Farm, but the legal process moved slowly, hampered by the complexity of the case and the need to establish probable cause for what would be an extensive search of a prominent businessman's property. This delay proved crucial, giving Baumeister time to realize that his carefully constructed world was beginning to collapse. The confrontation between Julie and her husband occurred on a humid evening in June 1996, when she finally summoned the courage to demand the truth about what had been happening on their property. According to her later testimony, Herb initially tried to maintain his facade of innocence, but when pressed with specific details about the bone discoveries and the police investigation, his mask finally slipped. What she saw underneath terrified her. Not the charming businessman she had married, but a cold, calculating predator who spoke about human life with the same detached professionalism he brought to his retail operations. That night, while her husband slept, Julie packed bags for herself and their children and fled to her mother's house in Indianapolis. The next morning, she contacted police and provided them with detailed information about the bone discoveries on the property, her husband's suspicious behavior, and her growing certainty that he was responsible for the disappearances of multiple young men. Her cooperation provided investigators with the final pieces they needed to obtain comprehensive search warrants for Fox Hollow Farm. Baumeister's reaction to his family's departure was swift and decisive. Rather than attempt to maintain his innocence or prepare a defense, he seemed to recognize that his killing spree had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. On June 21, 1996, he liquidated his business assets, withdrew large amounts of cash from various accounts, and loaded his car with camping supplies and personal effects. He left behind a brief note for his wife, expressing regret for the pain he had caused their family, but providing no explanation for his actions or acknowledgement of his crimes. The three-day manhunt that followed Baumeister's flight captured national attention as details of the Fox Hollow Farm investigation began to emerge. Media outlets initially focused on the sensational aspects of the case, the wealthy businessman leading a double life, the suburban mansion hiding a chamber of horrors. But as the scope of the investigation became clear, the story evolved into something far more complex and disturbing. Search teams working the Fox Hollow farm property faced conditions that veteran investigators later described as unlike anything in their experience. The 18-acre site had been used as a dumping ground for human remains for at least 5 years, with bodies dismembered and scattered across multiple locations in a pattern that suggested both systematic disposal and psychological ritual. Cadaver dogs led investigators to burial sites throughout the property. Remains buried under the pool house, bones scattered in the dense woods, fragments hidden in decorative garden areas that the Baumeister family had used for entertaining guests. The forensic analysis of the recovered remains presented investigators with a complex puzzle that would take years to fully solve. Many of the bones showed evidence of animal scavenging and weather damage, making identification extremely difficult. DNA technology in 1996 was not as advanced as it would later become, forcing investigators to rely on dental records, missing person reports, and personal effects to identify victims. The process was further complicated by the fact that many of Baumeister's victims had been estranged from their families or living on society's margins, meaning that accurate antemortem records were often unavailable. As the body count mounted, investigators began to realize that the Fox Hollow farm murders represented only a portion of Baumeister's killing spree. Evidence suggested that he had been active for much longer than initially suspected, possibly dating back to the early 1980s when he first achieved financial success. Interstate 70, the major highway connecting Indianapolis to other Midwestern cities, became a focus of the investigation as authorities began linking Baumeister to similar disappearances and murders across multiple states. The Interstate 70 connection revealed the true scope of Baumeister's activities and his evolution as a serial killer. Business records showed that he frequently traveled the highway for legitimate commercial purposes, attending trade shows and visiting suppliers across Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana. This travel provided perfect cover for predatory activities, allowing him to hunt in multiple jurisdictions while making it difficult for law enforcement agencies to recognize patterns that might have led to his earlier capture. In Columbus, Ohio, investigators reopened the cases of several young gay men who had disappeared between 1988 and 1994, finding striking similarities to the Indianapolis victims. The men had been approached by a well-dressed older man who claimed to be a successful businessman, promised them money or career opportunities, and then vanished. Local police had initially treated these as isolated missing person cases, but the Baumeister investigation revealed them to be part of a much larger pattern of predatory behavior. Similar patterns emerged in Illinois, where at least 3 young men had disappeared under circumstances that matched Baumeister's known methodology. Michael Riley, 27, had been last seen leaving a Chicago bar with a man matching Baumeister's description in August 1993. James Kaiser, 24, disappeared from an Indianapolis nightclub in September 1994 after being approached by someone calling himself Brian Smart. Peter Elliott, 28, vanished from a Dayton, Ohio establishment in March 1995, with witnesses reporting that he had been talking to an older man about business opportunities. The interstate nature of Baumeister's crimes explained why he had been able to kill for so long without detection. Each jurisdiction treated disappearances within their borders as isolated incidents, failing to recognize the connections that might have revealed the presence of a serial killer operating across state lines. This lack of communication between law enforcement agencies was a common problem in the pre-digital era, when sharing information required significant bureaucratic coordination and personal initiative from individual investigators. Meanwhile, the manhunt for Baumeister himself was expanding across multiple states as investigators tried to predict his likely destination. Financial records show that he had withdrawn approximately $40,000 in cash before fleeing, enough to sustain himself for months if he was careful with his spending. His business contacts and travel history suggested several possible routes of escape, including connections in the southeast, where Savalot had been exploring expansion opportunities. The end came on July 3, 1996, in Pinery Provincial Park near Grand Bend, Ontario. A park ranger conducting routine patrols discovered Baumeister's rental car parked in a remote camping area, with the engine still running and the radio playing softly. Herbert Baumeister was found approximately 50 yards away, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. He was 49 years old. The suicide note found in Baumeister's car was characteristically self-serving and devoid of genuine remorse. In 3 handwritten pages, he expressed regret for the pain his actions had caused his family, but provided no detailed confession or explanation for his crimes. He made oblique references to mistakes and problems that had gotten out of control, but never explicitly acknowledged the murders or expressed any sympathy for his victims. The note read more like the complaint of a businessman whose enterprise had failed than the final words of a man responsible for destroying dozens of lives. The recovery of Baumeister's body marked the end of the manhunt, but the beginning of a much longer process of understanding the full scope of his crimes. Investigators faced the daunting task of identifying victims, notifying families, and attempting to provide closure to communities that had been terrorized by a predator they never knew existed. The process was complicated by the degraded condition of many remains and the fact that several victims had been living under assumed names or had been estranged from their families. The identification process revealed the human cost of Baumeister's crimes in heartbreaking detail. Roger Goodlett, the HIV counsellor who had dedicated his life to helping others, was identified through dental records and personal effects found scattered across the Fox Hollow Farm property. His family, who had spent 2 years wondering about his fate, finally received the closure they had been seeking, though the knowledge of how he died brought little comfort. Stephen Hale's identification came through DNA analysis that matched samples provided by his mother, who had never stopped believing that her son would someday return home. The 26-year-old had been working 2 jobs to save money for college when he encountered Baumeister at an Indianapolis bar. His dreams of becoming a teacher died in the woods of Fox Hollow Farm, another casualty of a predator who saw human beings as objects to be used and discarded. The investigation also revealed victims whose identities may never be known. Bone fragments and personal effects suggested the presence of additional victims, but the condition of the remains made positive identification impossible. These unknown victims, likely young men from marginalized communities whose disappearances went unreported, represent the ultimate tragedy of the Baumeister case. Lives so devalued by society that even their deaths went unnoticed. The psychological profile of Herbert Baumeister that emerged from the investigation painted a picture of a man driven by a complex mixture of sexual compulsion, power fantasy, and deep-seated rage. Criminal psychologists who studied the case noted the calculated nature of his crimes, the careful maintenance of his public persona, and the ritualistic aspects of his victim disposal. These characteristics placed him among the most organized and methodical serial killers in American criminal history. The financial success that Baumeister achieved through his retail empire appeared to serve multiple psychological functions beyond simple material comfort. The wealth and status provided him with access to victims who might otherwise have been suspicious of his intentions. The respect accorded to successful businessmen in American society created a protective shield that deflected suspicion and made it easier for him to explain away suspicious behavior. Most importantly, the power and control he exercised in his business life seemed to feed the same psychological needs that drove his homicidal activities. Julie Baumeister's journey from devoted wife to whistleblower illustrated the complex dynamics that can exist in families harboring dangerous secrets. Her initial denial and rationalization of her husband's suspicious behavior reflected both her emotional investment in their marriage and the broader social tendency to dismiss evidence that contradicts our fundamental assumptions about the people closest to us. Her eventual decision to contact authorities required enormous courage, particularly given the potential consequences for herself and her children. The children who grew up at Fox Hollow Farm faced the devastating realization that their childhood home had been the site of horrific crimes. Erich Baumeister, who discovered the first skull, struggled with guilt and trauma that would affect him for years. The family's attempts to rebuild their lives were complicated by media attention, financial difficulties resulting from the seizure of Herbert's assets, and the ongoing investigation that kept their trauma in the public eye. The Fox Hollow Farm case exposed significant weaknesses in how law enforcement agencies approached missing person cases involving marginalized communities. The perfunctory investigations into the disappearances of gay men reflected both institutional prejudice and resource allocation decisions that effectively designated some victims as less worthy of protection than others. These systemic failures allowed Baumeister to kill with impunity for years, knowing that his chosen victim pool was unlikely to generate the kind of intensive investigation that might have led to his capture. The case also highlighted the challenges of investigating serial crimes that cross jurisdictional boundaries. In the 1990s, law enforcement agencies lacked the sophisticated databases and communication systems that might have revealed patterns earlier. The creation of VICAP, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, and other federal resources was partly a response to cases like Baumeister's, where the killer's mobility allowed him to evade detection by exploiting gaps in inter-agency cooperation. The impact of the Baumeister case extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The Indianapolis LGBTQ+ community, already marginalized and vulnerable, was forced to confront the reality that they had been hunted by a predator who exploited both their isolation and society's indifference to their welfare. The case prompted important conversations about police-community relations, victim advocacy, and the need for more inclusive approaches to public safety. The property that once housed such horrors eventually changed hands multiple times, with each successive owner struggling to overcome the stigma associated with its history. Fox Hollow Farm became a symbol of how evil can hide behind facades of respectability and success, a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who have mastered the art of appearing normal. The legacy of Herbert Baumeister serves as a chilling reminder of how serial killers can exploit societal prejudices and institutional failures to continue their crimes for years without detection. His case study is now used in criminal justice education to illustrate the importance of thorough investigation, regardless of a victim's social status, the need for effective interagency communication, and the psychological profiles that can help identify organized serial killers before they claim additional victims. The victims of Fox Hollow Farm were more than statistics in a criminal case. They were sons, brothers, friends, and lovers whose lives were cut short by a predator who saw them only as objects for his violent fantasies. Their stories, finally told through the painstaking work of investigators and advocates, serve as testimony to the value of every human life and the importance of creating a society where no one is considered expendable. In the end, Herbert Baumeister's suicide robbed his victims' families of the opportunity to see justice served in a courtroom. His refusal to provide a detailed confession left many questions unanswered and made it impossible to determine the full scope of his crimes. But the investigation that followed his death, the identification of his victims, and the exposure of the systemic failures that allowed him to kill for so long have contributed to important changes in how law enforcement approaches similar cases. The Fox Hollow Farm murders remain one of Indiana's most notorious criminal cases, a stark reminder that evil can flourish in the most unlikely places when society fails to protect its most vulnerable members. The victims' names are now etched in memorial plaques, their stories preserved in criminal justice archives, and their memory honoured by advocates who continue to fight for equality and justice for all victims of violent crime, regardless of their place in society's hierarchy. The investigation officially closed with over 20 confirmed victims, though the true number may never be known. Herbert Baumeister took his secrets to the grave, leaving behind a legacy of pain and loss that continues to reverberate through the families and communities he destroyed. His story serves as both a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked evil and a testament to the resilience of those who survived to tell the truth about what happened in the woods of Fox Hollow Farm.